Sammy Davis swam across a river in Vietnam with a broken back, 30 holes in his body, and an AK-47 round lodged in his thigh, and he did it 3 times to pull wounded men to safety while over 1,000 enemy soldiers tried to kill him. And that's not even the part of the story that makes people shake their heads. The part that really gets you is what came after. Years later, a movie called Forrest Gump showed a scene where the main character gets the Medal of Honor from President Johnson. And most people watching that scene had no idea they were looking at real footage, actual historical film of a real ceremony. That was Sammy Davis. That was his moment. They just put Tom Hanks's face over it. So when people started calling Sammy Davis the real Forrest Gump, it wasn't some marketing thing or some nickname somebody made up for fun. It came from the fact that Hollywood literally used his Medal of Honor ceremony in one of the biggest movies ever made. And the true story behind that ceremony, the night that earned Sammy Davis that medal, is one of the most brutal and unlikely survival stories to come out of the entire Vietnam War. To really understand what Sammy Davis went through, you have to go back to the Mekong Delta in November of 1967 and picture what that place was like. The Delta was nothing like the jungle highlands most people think of when they imagine Vietnam. It was flat. It was wet. It was crisscrossed with rivers and canals and rice paddies that stretched out in every direction. The ground was soft, the air was heavy, and everything felt damp all the time. American forces operating in the Delta had to deal with terrain that didn't favor them at all. You couldn't dig deep foxholes because water would seep in. You couldn't move heavy equipment easily because the roads were bad and the mud was worse. And the enemy knew that area like the back of their hand. They had been fighting there for years, first against the French, then against the South Vietnamese, and now against the Americans. By late 1967, the war was at a strange point. American troop levels were high, somewhere around 400,000 men in country, and the military leadership kept telling the public that progress was being made. But the soldiers on the ground knew better. They knew the enemy wasn't beaten. They knew the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army were still capable of massing large forces and hitting hard when they wanted to. And that's exactly what happened on the night of November 18, 1967, near a place called Khe Sanh. Sammy Lee Davis was a young artilleryman assigned to Battery C, 2nd Battalion, 4th Artillery, which was part of the 9th Infantry Division. He was a cannoneer, which meant his job was to load and fire a 105mm howitzer, one of the standard artillery pieces used by American forces in Vietnam. Artillery units like the ones Sammy Davis served in usually set up in fire support bases, sometimes called fire bases, where they could provide covering fire for infantry units operating in the area. On that particular day, Battery C had moved to a position along a river to support an infantry operation. The infantry was pushing through the area, trying to sweep for enemy forces, and the artillery was there to back them up if things got hot. There were only about 42 artillerymen at that position. They weren't a large force. They had their howitzers set up. They had dug what foxholes they could in the soft ground, and they were doing their job, waiting to be called on if the infantry needed fire support. What nobody expected was that a massive enemy force was already moving toward them. The official records say it was a reinforced battalion of Viet Cong, maybe 1,500 men. But Sammy Davis himself has said, and other veterans of that night have confirmed, that the enemy soldiers they faced that night weren't local guerrillas. They were wearing uniforms. They were well-equipped. They were disciplined. They were almost certainly North Vietnamese Army regulars, NVA, not Viet Cong. The reason the official citation says Viet Cong instead of NVA has to do with politics. At that time, the American government was still insisting that North Vietnamese regular forces weren't operating that far south. Admitting that NVA battalions were deep in the Mekong Delta would have contradicted the official story about how the war was going. So the paperwork said Viet Cong, even though the men who were there knew what they were really facing. Sammy Davis has talked about this in interviews over the years. He's said those soldiers came at them in waves, 150 to 200 at a time, charging across the river with their weapons held up over their heads. And he's said, with a kind of respect that only soldiers who've faced real enemies can have, that those men were good. They were scary, sure, but they were doing their job, just like the Americans were doing theirs. That kind of honesty is part of what makes Sammy Davis's story so powerful. He doesn't pretend the enemy was incompetent or cowardly. He acknowledges that they were professional soldiers who fought hard and died hard. The attack came at night, which was typical for enemy operations in Vietnam. Darkness gave the attackers cover and made it harder for American air support and reinforcements to respond quickly. The enemy force hit the small artillery position from across the river, and what followed was hours of close, desperate, terrifying combat. The river that ran alongside the American position wasn't deep for most of its width, maybe waist-high or so, but right near the American bank there was a drop-off, a deeper channel that the attackers had to swim or wade through before climbing up onto the shore. Santa Davis has described watching the enemy come across, seeing them holding their rifles up, then disappearing into that deeper water, and then seeing hands come up out of the water as they pulled themselves toward the bank. He's said that image is part of his nightmares to this day, hands coming up out of the water. The Americans opened up with everything they had: rifles, machine guns, and, most importantly, the howitzers themselves. Now, artillery pieces aren't normally used for direct fire against charging infantry. They're designed to lob shells in high arcs onto distant targets. But the 105mm howitzer could fire a special round called a beehive round, and that round was devastating at close range. A beehive round was basically a giant shotgun shell filled with thousands of tiny metal darts called flechettes. When it was fired, those flechettes spread out in a cone and shredded anything in their path. Against massed infantry charging across open ground, it was horrifically effective. Sammy Davis and his gun crew were firing beehive rounds directly into the waves of attackers, and the effect was terrible. But the enemy kept coming. There were just too many of them, and they were determined. They weren't stopping. And then Sammy Davis's howitzer took a direct hit. An enemy soldier with a rocket-propelled grenade, an RPG, put a round right into the gun position. The explosion blew Sammy Davis and his crew off the howitzer. It knocked Sammy unconscious and left him lying half in and half out of his foxhole. The enemy soldiers started swarming the position. They were shooting the wounded and stabbing them with bayonets. Sammy Davis should have been killed right there. But the crew of the next howitzer over, seeing that Sammy's gun had been knocked out and assuming everyone on it was dead, made a split-second decision. They turned their own howitzer and fired a beehive round across Sammy Davis's position to kill the enemy soldiers who were about to finish him off. That beehive round saved Sammy Davis's life. It killed the enemy soldiers who were standing over him, about to shoot him, but it also hit Sammy himself. 30 flechettes tore into his body. Added to that, he had shrapnel wounds from the RPG, an AK-47 bullet lodged in his thigh, broken ribs, and as he would later learn, a broken back. When Sammy Davis came to, he was lying in the bottom of his shallow foxhole, and at first he couldn't hear anything. The blast had temporarily deafened him. All he could see were the tracers flying overhead, red tracers from American weapons, blue and green tracers from enemy weapons, crisscrossing in the dark. He's described that moment in interviews, saying it looked almost pretty, all those colored lights streaking through the air, until his hearing started to come back and he could hear the gunfire and explosions again. And then he remembered where he was and what was happening. Despite his wounds, despite the pain, Sammy Davis got back into the fight. He fired every artillery round he could get his hands on. He fired his M16 until he was out of ammunition. And then he saw something that changed everything. Across the river, on the enemy side, he saw a man waving a boonie hat. It was an American soldier. His name was Gwendolyn Holloway, from Stockton, California. Holloway was part of a small infantry element that had been on the other side of the river when the attack started. Now he was stranded over there, wounded, surrounded by enemy soldiers. Sammy Davis didn't really know Gwendolyn Holloway. They had seen each other around, the way soldiers do, but they weren't friends in any real sense. But that didn't matter. Holloway was an American. He was wounded, he was trapped, and Sammy Davis wasn't going to leave him there. So Sammy Davis went into the river. Remember, at this point, Sammy had a broken back. He had crushed ribs. He had 30 beehive flechettes in his body. He had an AK-47 round in his thigh, and he swam across that river anyway, through water that was being churned up by gunfire, with enemy soldiers still all around. When Sammy Davis got to the other side, he found Holloway in a foxhole with 2 other wounded men. One was Billy Ray Crawford from Alvin, Texas. Crawford had lost his leg just below the knee. The other was a man named Jim Deister, who had been shot through the head. When Sammy found them, the others told him Deister was dead, and looking at him, it was easy to believe. A man shot through the head usually is dead. But Sammy Davis had seen what the enemy was doing to American bodies. They were mutilating them. He wasn't going to leave Deister's body behind to be desecrated, dead or not. So Sammy Davis picked up Jim Deister, put him on his back, and swam back across the river. His legs were still working, he said, so he kicked his way across with Deister draped over him. When he got to the American side, the other artillerymen helped pull Deister out of the water, and then Sammy Davis immediately turned around and swam back. On the second trip, he got Billy Ray Crawford and Gwendolyn Holloway. Crawford, missing part of his leg, and Holloway, wounded but conscious, both held on to Sammy as he swam, and he got them across. His fellow soldiers helped pull them out of the water on the American side. Sammy Davis has described lying in that river after the last trip, feeling the cool water on his wounds, and thinking that his job was done. He was ready to let go. He started to sink. And then, he said, something happened that he can't fully explain. He's described it as feeling like someone picked him up out of the water and held him, and a voice told him, "Son, your job isn't done yet." Then he was back in the water, and he swam to the bank, which was only 10 or 15 feet away, and he pulled himself out and rejoined his fellow soldiers. Now, whether you interpret that moment as divine intervention, as a hallucination brought on by blood loss and trauma, or as something else entirely, that's up to you. Sammy Davis is a man of faith, and he believes God saved him that night for a reason. But whatever you believe about that moment, the physical facts of what Sammy Davis did are documented and undeniable. He saved 3 men. He made multiple trips across a river under fire while severely wounded. He continued to fight, even after being blown off his gun and hit by friendly fire. Jim Deister, the man who had been shot through the head and was believed to be dead, survived. Against all odds, he lived. Sammy Davis's refusal to leave him behind turned out to be the right call. even though there was no way to know that at the time. The battle continued through the night. The enemy finally broke contact around 8 o'clock the next morning. When the sun came up, the American position was still there. 42 artillerymen had held off an attack by over 1,000 enemy soldiers. The beehive rounds had been devastatingly effective. The ground around the American position was covered with enemy dead. But the Americans had taken casualties too, and the survivors were exhausted, wounded, and traumatized. Sammy Davis sat at the edge of his foxhole that morning, hurting in ways he didn't fully understand. He could see the bullet wound in his thigh, but he couldn't figure out why his whole body was in so much pain. He didn't realize yet that he had been hit by 30 beehive flechettes, that those tiny metal darts had punched holes through his liver, his kidney, his back, his chest. The scar tissue from those wounds would cause him chronic pain for the rest of his life. Doctors have told him that every time he moves, he tears that scar tissue a little, which creates more pain, which creates more scar tissue. It's a cycle that never ends. Sammy Davis had one flechette lodged in his left kidney that was never removed. He has holes in his liver. He lives with constant pain. But as he's said many times, you don't lose till you quit trying. And he hasn't quit yet. The Army recognized what Sammy Davis did that night. The official Medal of Honor citation describes how he, quote, displayed extraordinary heroism in close combat action against hostile forces, unquote. It describes how he single-handedly fired his howitzer at point-blank range, how he was blown off his gun by an enemy recoilless rifle round, how he crossed the river despite his wounds to rescue 3 comrades. The medal was awarded to Sammy Davis by President Lyndon B. Johnson at the White House on November 19, 1968, almost exactly a year after the battle. The ceremony was filmed, as all Medal of Honor ceremonies are, and the footage became part of the historical record. Fast forward to 1994. The movie Forrest Gump was released, and it became one of the biggest films of the decade. Part of the movie's gimmick was inserting the fictional character Forrest Gump into real historical footage. They put him in meetings with presidents, at major events, and, in one memorable scene, receiving the Medal of Honor from President Johnson for heroism in Vietnam. The filmmakers used real footage of a Medal of Honor ceremony for that scene. They digitally replaced the face of the real recipient with Tom Hanks' face. But the body, the uniform, the background, the president, the medal itself, all of that was from an actual ceremony, and that ceremony was Sammy Davis's. When the movie came out, Sammy Davis started getting recognized. People who knew the history would see the scene and realize that the footage looked familiar. Eventually, word spread that the real Forrest Gump was an actual person, a living Medal of Honor recipient named Sammy Davis, who was still out there, still alive, still telling his story. The nickname stuck, and Sammy Davis, who has a good sense of humor about it, has embraced the connection, even while making sure people understand that his story is real, not fiction. He's not a character in a movie. He's a man who went to war, who nearly died multiple times in a single night, who saved 3 lives while his own body was falling apart, and who lived to tell about it. There are details about that night that Sammy Davis has shared over the years that don't make it into the official citations or the formal histories. He's talked about the nightmares that never went away, the images of hands coming up out of the water, the eyes of the enemy soldiers as they charged. He's talked about the respect he has for those enemy soldiers, even though they were trying to kill him. He's talked about the guilt that many combat veterans carry, the wondering why you survived when others didn't. He's talked about faith, about feeling God's presence in that river, about believing he was saved for a purpose. He's talked about the physical pain that never stops, the constant ache from scar tissue and old wounds that no amount of time or medicine can fully fix. And he's talked about the importance of telling these stories, of making sure people remember what happened and who was there and what was sacrificed. Sammy Davis has spent decades since Vietnam traveling, speaking, sharing his story. He's visited schools, military bases, veteran organizations, and civic groups. He's talked to thousands of people about what it means to serve, what it means to sacrifice, what it means to keep going when everything in you wants to stop. He's become an ambassador of sorts for Vietnam veterans, a generation of servicemen who often came home to indifference or hostility, and who spent years struggling to get the recognition and support they deserved. There's something important about the fact that Sammy Davis's story became famous through Forrest Gump, even if it was in a strange, accidental way. That movie reached millions of people who might never have otherwise thought about the Medal of Honor or the sacrifices made in Vietnam. And when those people learned that the ceremony they saw on screen was real, that there was an actual Sammy Davis behind that footage, it connected them to history in a way that dry facts and statistics never could. Sammy Davis is proof that reality is often more extraordinary than fiction. The character of Forrest Gump was a lovable, simple-minded man who stumbled into heroism almost by accident. The real man whose ceremony was used in that film is nothing like that. Sammy Davis is sharp, articulate, funny, and deeply thoughtful about his experiences. He didn't stumble into heroism. He made a choice over and over again to keep fighting, to save his fellow soldiers, to refuse to quit even when his body was destroyed. That's not accidental heroism. That's will. That's character. That's something far more impressive than anything Hollywood could invent. The men Sammy Davis saved that night went on to live their lives because of what he did. Gwendolyn Holloway, Billy Ray Crawford, Jim Deister. They all survived because one broken, bleeding, barely conscious artilleryman decided he wasn't going to leave them behind. That's the real story. Not the movie scene, not the nickname, not the celebrity that came later. The real story is about a young man from the Midwest who went to war, who found himself in an impossible situation, and who did what needed to be done, regardless of the cost to himself. The battle near Khe Sanh on November 18, 1967, was one of many brutal engagements in the Mekong Delta that year. It's not as famous as some other battles of the Vietnam War. It doesn't have a catchy name like the Tet Offensive or the Battle of Ia Drang. But for the 42 artillerymen who fought there, and especially for Sammy Davis, it was the defining moment of their lives. Everything that came before led up to that night, and everything that came after was shaped by it. Sammy Davis has said that the war never really leaves you. The physical wounds heal as much as they're going to heal, but the mental and emotional wounds are different. They come back. They visit you in dreams. They show up when you least expect them, and you learn to live with them, or you don't. Sammy Davis learned to live with them. He learned to use his experiences to help others, to connect with fellow veterans, to give meaning to what happened by making sure it wasn't forgotten. The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government. It's given for actions that involve risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. More than 3,500 men have received it since it was first created during the Civil War. But the number of living recipients at any given time is small, usually fewer than 100. These men, and the rare women who have received it, are part of an exclusive fraternity of extraordinary courage. Sammy Davis is one of them. He's carried that honor for more than 50 years now. He's represented it with dignity, with humor, with honesty about both the glory and the horror of combat. He hasn't tried to be something he's not. He hasn't pretended that war is clean or simple or glorious in the way movies sometimes make it look. He's told the truth, which is that war is terrifying and painful and confusing, and that courage doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what needs to be done anyway. One of the things that stands out about Sammy Davis when you hear him speak or read his interviews is how much he emphasizes the other men. He talks about his gun crew, about the other artillerymen who fought that night, about the infantry soldiers who were there. He talks about the 3 men he rescued as if they're the heroes, not him. That kind of humility is common among Medal of Honor recipients. They often deflect praise onto others, onto the men who didn't make it home, onto the ordinary soldiers who never got medals but who served just as bravely. Sammy Davis doesn't see himself as special. He sees himself as a man who did his job when his job demanded everything he had. The fact that his job that night included swimming a river 3 times with a broken back, well, that was just what had to be done. You hear that attitude from a lot of combat veterans, that sense that they just did what anyone would have done in the same situation. But of course, that's not true. Not everyone would have done what Sammy Davis did. Not everyone could have. The combination of physical endurance, mental toughness, selflessness, and sheer stubborn refusal to quit that Sammy Davis displayed that night is rare. That's why they give medals for it. That's why we remember it. The connection to Forrest Gump has given Sammy Davis a platform he might not otherwise have had. It's brought attention to his story and to the stories of Vietnam veterans more broadly. But it's also created a kind of strange situation where a fictional character is sometimes more famous than the real man whose moment was borrowed for a movie. Sammy Davis has handled that with grace. He's used the attention to keep telling his story, to keep honoring the men who served, to keep reminding people that behind the movies and the myths are real human beings who bled and suffered and sometimes died. There's something deeply American about Sammy Davis's story. Not in a flag-waving political way, but in a human way. It's about ordinary people being asked to do extraordinary things and finding out that they can. It's about loyalty to your buddies, about refusing to leave a man behind even when saving him might kill you. It's about getting knocked down and getting back up, over and over, until the fight is done. Those are values that resonate across political lines and generational divides. They're not about whether the war was right or wrong, whether the politicians made good decisions or bad ones, whether America should have been in Vietnam at all. They're about what individual human beings are capable of when everything is on the line. Sammy Davis was 21 years old on the night of November 18, 1967. 21. Just a kid by most standards. He had his whole life ahead of him, and he nearly lost it all in a few hours of chaos and violence along a muddy river in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. But he didn't lose it. He survived. He came home. He built a life. He got married, had children, became a grandfather. He dealt with the pain and the memories and the challenges of being a combat veteran in a country that didn't always treat its veterans well. And he kept telling his story, kept showing up, kept refusing to quit. That's the part of Sammy Davis's story that matters most, maybe more than the heroism itself. It's what he did with the rest of his life. Surviving a battle is one thing. Building a meaningful life after that battle is something else. It takes a different kind of courage, a quieter kind, the kind that doesn't earn medals but that matters just as much. Sammy Davis found that courage too. When you really sit with the story of what Sammy Davis did that night in the Mekong Delta, it's hard not to feel something. Awe, maybe. Gratitude, certainly. A kind of wondering about whether you would have what it takes to do the same thing. Most of us will never know the answer to that question, and that's probably a good thing. But Sammy Davis knows his answer. He found out on November 18, 1967, when he was 21 years old and the world was exploding around him, and 3 wounded men were trapped on the wrong side of a river. He found out that he had what it takes. And because he did, 3 men lived who would have died. Because he did, a story exists that has inspired countless people for more than 50 years. Because he did, we have a reminder that ordinary people really can do extraordinary things when it matters most. That's the legacy of Sammy Davis. Not the movie scene, not the nickname, not the medal hanging in a case somewhere. The legacy is the truth of what one young artilleryman did on the worst night of his life, and what he kept doing every day after that by refusing to let the story be forgotten. However you feel about war, about Vietnam, about any of it, what Sammy Davis did matters. It mattered to Gwendolyn Holloway. It mattered to Billy Ray Crawford. It mattered to Jim Deister. It mattered to their families and everyone who loved them. And in some way, it matters to all of us, because it shows us something about what people are capable of when they decide they're not going to quit no matter what. Sammy Davis decided that, and he stuck to it, and he's still sticking to it all these years later. That's something worth remembering. That's something worth telling. And now, you've heard it the way it deserves to be heard. Not polished up or prettified, just the truth about a man and a night and a river and a choice that changed everything. Sammy Davis, the real guy behind the movie scene, the man who swam a river with a broken back to save his brothers, the man who never quit. That's his story, and it's one of the most remarkable stories to come out of the whole Vietnam War.